Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 6th of July 1924, it's not looking good for the Channel Tunnel, Everest, or blokes buying chocolate in a cinema. But first, a correction. Last week I mentioned a shooting that, according to the Times, took place in Rossburg, Florida. A correspondent has written to point out that there is no Rossburg in Florida, but there is a Rossburg in Ohio. You do wonder how the Times managed to mix up those two states. And now for some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. Last week the Democratic Convention opened in New York. They are having extreme difficulty in deciding who of their number should go down to humiliating defeat to sitting President Calvin Coolidge in November. This is made harder by the fact that the winner has to get over 50% of the votes, and low-polling candidates are not eliminated. On Wednesday we learnt that they were up to the 20th ballot, on Friday the 54th ballot, and on Saturday the 65th ballot. The leading candidates are William McAdoo, a former Treasury Secretary, and Al Smith, Governor of New York State. Last week I suggested that the assassination of the Italian socialist politician Giacomo Matteotti, far from injuring Mussolini, would in fact help him strengthen his grip on the fascist party. This week brought the news that a large number of new government appointments were of Mussolini's supporters. Stalin's humiliation of Trotsky continues. This week the Times reported that the Soviet press is no longer publishing Trotsky's speeches. An official report into the Army of the Irish Free State has indicated that there are large numbers of irregulars, the rebels in the Irish Civil War, in its ranks. There are fears that there will be a strike in the building industry. The capital of Norway, Christiania, has been renamed Oslo for reasons that are not entirely clear, or at least not entirely clear to the Times reader. There is a Moorish rising in the Spanish part of Morocco. There's a bill before Parliament to ban seditious and blasphemous teaching. There is a bit of a panic about what communists may be teaching children in their Sunday schools. Police inspecting a consignment at the docks found that it contained machine gun parts. The speculation is that they were destined for the Soviet Union. The trial of the participants in the Empire Exhibition Rodeo has begun. Some witnesses have pointed to broken legs and other injuries amongst the animals involved. Other witnesses have suggested that this is no worse than fox hunting. Escalators have been installed at Moorgate Station. It was a big deal in those days. In the 18th of May episode I mentioned that the Soviet Union was trying to repossess its embassy in Chesham Place. This week we discovered that its current possessors have found a novel use for it. They've turned it into a jazz club. We discovered that because the neighbours are suing because they can't get to sleep at night. So what's best? The Russian embassy as a jazz club, or as a nest of communist spies? I'm going with communist spies. I mentioned in the 15th of June episode that there was an ongoing correspondence on the question of what language Bateman Hollweg, Chancellor of Germany at the outbreak of the First World War, used to describe the treaty that guaranteed Belgian neutrality as a scrap of paper. It's still going on. There's even been an investigation of Foreign Office records, which has proved inconclusive. It's amazing how many quotes from the First World War don't stand up to scrutiny. Lions led by donkeys being the classic example. Kitty McKane has won the Ladies' Championship at Wimbledon. The Paris Olympics are about to be officially opened, which is a bit odd given that the football tournament has already finished. The Times thinks that Britain has almost no chance in the athletics events, which, spoiler alert, given that there will be a movie made about it, is a bit embarrassing. There's been an ongoing correspondence on the subject of road surfaces. Some say asphalt is too slippery, while others say concrete tends to break up. Annoyingly, one correspondent seemed to draw a distinction between asphalt and tarmac. I thought they were the same thing. Also this week there were calls for bus tickets to be numbered in much the same way as you used to get at daily counters. This was to prevent overcrowding. We also learnt that trams, as if they weren't in enough trouble already from the competition, faced a new threat: radio aerials. It seems that they had to be rather big in those days, But if they fell onto a tram's overhead power line, that was it for the tram. On a Thursday, the Times published a letter from a Peter Burt. In your leading article of June the 30th, you refer to Mr. Shaw, the Minister of Labour, as a staid and conservative trade unionist. Will you, on the grounds of patriotism, allow me to correct that impression? Mr. Shaw is a member of the Socialist Labour Party. It cannot be too widely made known that socialism is an international parasite which has fastened itself upon trade unionism. Trade unions did great work for the working classes with great efficiency before they came under socialist control. Since then they have been of great power and glory to socialist officials and to German intrigue. The party has already brought the world to the door of the skilled mechanic and others. Until the public can distinguish between trade unionism and socialism, there is no hope of industrial peace, and very little indeed of international peace. I've heard it said that there was a time before trade unions were taken over by socialists. Burt seems to be confirming this. The stuff about German intrigue is probably a reference to the half-hearted support and often downright opposition to the war effort among many socialists. I am not sure what bringing the world to the door is all about. It's not immigration, which was not an issue in 1924, except for America. So far this year, trade unionism has given our forebears a railway strike, a dock strike, a bus and tram strike, and an underground power strike. I saw this in Wednesday's edition. After falling from his bicycle at Maidenhead and fracturing his skull, Desmond Charles Albrow, aged 37 of Stoke Pogis, walked to Burnham, a distance of 3 miles. He was then taken to Slough Infirmary, where he died soon after admission. That was on page 11. There was rather worse news for cyclists over the page. An increase of almost 50% in the fatal accidents occurring to pedal cyclists in London is recorded in a statement issued yesterday by the Commissioner of Police at Scotland Yard. The Commissioner reports that an examination of the fatal accident statistics for the month of April reveals the fact that the number of pedal cyclists killed in the Metropolitan Police District was 17, and for the 4 months ended April the 30th of this year, the number was no less than 50. This increase, he states, is almost 50% compared with the corresponding period last year. The Commissioner would point out that from the nature of the vehicles, the dangers to pedal cyclists in crowded thoroughfares are very considerable on days when the roads are greasy, through rain and mud, and he would urge all persons who find it necessary to use the cycle in the busier areas to take alternative routes as far as possible, and avoid thoroughfares which are normally thronged with heavy motor traffic. The internal combustion engine may have displaced the horse in a fair fight, but the same cannot be said for the way it is dealing with cycling. By the 1980s, cyclists had almost disappeared from London's roads, apart from me. For some odd reason I needed to cycle from Waterloo to Euston in 1985 or thereabouts. Never again. I saw this in a case involving a charge of false imprisonment against a cinema, brought by a Thomas Henry Butler. Mr. Butler was a wholesale and retail fish merchant, carrying on business in the City of London. On June the 26th, 1923, he went to the Ilford Super Cinema with his wife. During the exhibition of films, he went to the back of the balcony where he was sitting. He bought some chocolates from a girl attendant named Newman and took them to his wife. Shortly afterwards, a male attendant asked him to go to the manager's room. This was how the claim of false imprisonment arose. He did so, and he was then charged with indecently assaulting the girl Newman. Next day he was charged at the police court, and at an adjourned hearing he was committed for trial at Chelmsford Quarter Sessions, where the jury acquitted him. What to make of this? I think the first thing to point out is that this is a case of he says, she says. It is difficult to know where the truth lies. The second is that the cinema, and by extension a lot of people, take this sort of thing very seriously. In 1924. The third is that the police pursued the case. So they thought there was a good chance the prosecution would succeed. The fourth is that a jury acquitted. They didn't think much of the case at all. perhaps because this was all alleged to have happened very near the accused's wife. By the way, Butler succeeded in his charge of false imprisonment and was awarded £150 or 30 ounces of gold in damages. Another area of contemporary uncertainty is over whether Everest has been conquered. The Times has been publishing dispatches from the failed expedition to climb the mountain, which claimed the lives of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. A number of camps were set up on the mountain. One member of the expedition, Odell, was between two of the highest when he looked up to see two black spots in motion. There was but one explanation. It was Mallory and his companion moving, as I could see even at that great distance, with considerable alacrity, realizing doubtless that they had none too many hours of daylight to reach the summit from their present position and return to Camp 6 at nightfall. The place on the ridge mentioned is a prominent rock step at a very short distance from the base of the final pyramid, and it was remarkable that they were so late in reaching this place. According to Mallory's schedule, they should have reached it several hours earlier if they had started from the high camp as anticipated. Speculation has raged ever since over whether the two made it to the top. Mallory's body was found in 1999, but his camera was not. This account seems to suggest that things were already going wrong for them. Sir Francis Younghusband, chairman of the Mount Everest Committee, was far from downhearted. The doom of Everest is sealed, and for one very obvious reason. Man grows in wisdom and stature, but the mountain's stature is fixed. Man can exalt the spirit within him, but the mountain cannot add a single cubit to her measure. Everest fights stoutly and with many terrible weapons. She is girt about with unscalable rocks, and she has snow and ice, wind and frost to aid her, and one might add a lack of oxygen. But she fights blindly. She cannot learn by experience, and she cannot rise to the occasion, and she is opposed by an adversary who has all these advantages over her. For man is full of cunning, he profits by experience, and battling only increases his spirit. Man may indeed have all those qualities, but it's going to take another 29 years for him to succeed. Last week I mentioned the commercial plans, to build a tunnel under the English Channel. This week the Times dedicated an editorial to the subject. The deputation which waited on Mr. Asquith in 1913 yes, there have been a few goes at this over the years, to petition for a hearing of its claims, represented some 90 members of Parliament. Those who approached Mr. MacDonald on Thursday are said to have represented 400. Until the war, the great mass of enlightened opinion was no less resolutely opposed to the scheme. On military, international, sentimental, and even commercial grounds, it was decided over and over again that the advantages claimed for it were illusory, and that the whole idea was alien to the genius loci, it means the spirit of a place, of the country, and contrary to its true interests. You do have to wonder how the Industrial Revolution ever got going in the first place with attitudes like this. What is it then that has wrought this change in the traditional convictions of so large a proportion of the Commons? Obviously, there is one main answer: the war and the development in the art of flying which it brought about. England, so runs the argument, is no longer an island. The narrow seas that surround it, and the ships that guard them, have ceased to be its bulwarks. They have been crossed, and will be crossed again if war breaks out by hostile aircraft. True, but they won't be able to carry occupying forces. If it is on account of aircraft that England is no longer an island, then it might be thought that the rapid development of civil aviation, rather than an enormously costly, and, as another correspondent suggests, unprofitable, feat of engineering should be the natural channel of closer intercourse with the continent. I don't quite see why the alleged unprofitability should enter into the government's calculations. After all, if the project goes bust, it's not their problem. Of course, one does wonder if the London-Paris air route might not still be with us if the governments hadn't spent billions on high-speed lines to the tunnel. The editorial expresses doubt about how useful the tunnel would be in a war. On the whole, there seems to be a strong probability that the promised advantages of the tunnel are much less real than its promoters suggest, and that the primitive national instinct which distrusts the project is neither spent nor quite irrational. In the circumstances, to discount all the military objections to the tunnel on the assumption that England's birthright as an island has been taken from her is at least premature. It seems to me that military objections are the only valid objections. There are a couple that spring to mind. One is that a tunnel would become a route for invasion. I would have thought that it would be easy enough to flood or block the tunnel and, failing that, bomb or shell the entrance. But I could be wrong. The other objection is that a tunnel would put some channel shipping out of business, meaning that in wartime there would be less for the military to use. A Sir R.W. Perks, who was involved in the attempt to build a tunnel in 1881, chipped in. The hopes of the British Company were, however, completely shattered in 1882 when Lord Lansdowne's committee, influenced mainly by the military evidence, decided by a majority of 6-4 against the scheme. That's pretty close. If the Channel Tunnel was needed half a century ago, its commercial necessity and value are unquestionably far greater today than they were then. Not only has the trade between the country and the continent very materially increased, but the necessity for the cultivation of that traffic is greater than it ever was. On Wednesday, the Times reported on a meeting that the Prime Minister held with the Chiefs of Staff and former Prime Ministers. The meeting was not a long one, and the result of it is to be communicated to a meeting of the Cabinet which is being held today. It is understood, however, that the views of the Chiefs of Staff of the three fighting services have undergone no modification from the experience gained during the war, and that they remain strongly of opinion that the Channel Tunnel should not be constructed. And this was from Thursday. It is understood that the Cabinet accepted the views expressed at the meeting of the Committee of Imperial Defence, held on the previous day, which were entirely adverse to the scheme, and that the Cabinet agreed that no further steps could be usefully taken in the matter at this stage. Well, at least the decision was quick. I find it difficult to believe that it was beyond the wit of man or staff officer to devise a scheme to balk the tunnel if required, but the military advice seems clear enough. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.